The jungle wrapped around São Lucio like a velvet curtain soaked in sweat and secrets. Its trees standing still not out of peace, but from the weight of something older than time itself, something that breathed beneath the soil. Locals said the hill above the village pulsed at night, not metaphorically, but physically, as if some gray, slumbering beast slept beneath it, exhaling in rhythmic gusts that made the palms rustle and the dirt quiver ever so slightly. It was never charted on maps. No roads led to it. Only the desperate or the mad ever stumbled upon São Lucio, tucked away in the heart of Goiás, like a forgotten relic, unclaimed by church or state. The year was 1926, and it began with a woman dragging her son by the wrist under the cover of night, whispering fervent prayers that clashed with the chirping of insects. Her name was Salome, and her son Jairo was blind since birth. The village elders had warned her not to go near the hill, not to tempt the spirits that guarded it. But mothers who've heard their child weep from darkness for 9 years do not heed warnings. They make bargains. And so she climbed, barefoot and bleeding, carrying her child to the summit where the earth pulsed hot and the wind whistled through hollow stones shaped like broken mouths. She placed him on a flat stone, later called Pedra dos Olhos, and sobbed out a prayer in no particular direction. When Jairo began to scream, the jungle fell silent. When his eyes opened, the stars reflected in them like glass, and for the first time in his short life, he described his mother's face. That was how it began. One boy screaming into the dark, and a scream that reached places it shouldn't have. Within days, São Lucio transformed. First came the villagers from neighboring towns, carrying children with twisted spines, women whose bellies had gone cold mid-pregnancy, men whose skin peeled in leprous heats. They came not with hope, but dread disguised as devotion, and what they found waiting for them was a trio of strangers. A tall man with a rosary made of bones who introduced himself only as Padre Elias, a dark-skinned woman with cataracts in both eyes called Mãe Graciela, who claimed to see more than most, and a silent girl no older than 10 with eyes so black they reflected nothing, known simply as Isa. The three never spoke of where they came from. Padre Elias insisted the spirits chose them, that they were anointed through suffering, not selection, and when asked who the spirits were, he would smile with teeth too white and say, "They'll tell you when they're ready, but not if you ask." Mãe Graciela, despite her blindness, would often find herbs in places no botanist had ever recorded them, plants that bled red sap, or emitted a scent that made people weep with forgotten memories. And Isa, the little girl who never spoke, would merely touch the afflicted and close her eyes, as if listening to something beneath the skin, and more often than not, they would be cured. The faith healers never accepted money. They slept on mats woven from palm fronds and ate what the villagers gave them, but they demanded silence. No idle questions, no prayers after dark, and above all, no entering the hill after midnight. Those who broke that rule returned changed, or didn't return at all. In the following months, São Lucio evolved into something between a temple and a quarantine. The wooden chapel that once held 10 now held hundreds. The sound of bells was replaced by gongs carved from meteorite fragments, whose vibrations unsettled even the bones. Miracles happened daily. too many to ignore, too fast to be lies. A mute spoke. A child born with 6 legs walked with 2. A bishop from Belo Horizonte arrived in secret, riddled with pancreatic cancer, and left 3 days later bowed, oited with tears but free of pain. Newspapers whispered of it, but none dared print names. It wasn't a scandal. It was a mystery. The kind that clawed at the edges of civilization and begged to stay forgotten. Padre Elias preached sermons that made no theological sense but left people weeping. Sermons about rivers that remembered, blood that sang in frequencies, wounds that were locked doors instead of punishments. My Graciela interpreted dreams people hadn't yet had. And Isa, oh Isa, began drawing spirals on the dirt, over and over, until the villagers began seeing them in their sleep. There were darker things, too. A farmer claimed his son returned from a healing, but no longer recognized his mother. Another man slit his own throat after confessing that the voices won't stop humming. Animals refused to go near the faith healer's quarters. Children who had once been joyful began to sleepwalk toward the hill at night. And though the healers still performed miracles, something about them began to shift. Padre Elias no longer looked people in the eye. My Graciela spoke of shadows that followed her even under sunlight. Isa stopped touching the afflicted and started drawing them instead, hideous charcoal portraits of people before they were healed, yet with eyes gouged out, mouths stitched, limbs misplaced. And still, the miracles came. People ignored the unease because the suffering needed answers, and the hill gave them. By 1930, São Lucio was not just a village. It was a destination, a secret that passed between coughing aristocrats and failing generals, a last resort for the incurable. But while many arrived and walked away grinning with new breath and soft skin, others stayed behind, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. A governor's wife disappeared during a night vigil. A young boy was found mumbling verses in a language no one recognized, his hands fused at the palms. Rumors rose like steam, that the hill required sacrifice, that the spirits asked for balance, that for every miracle granted, a price was paid in memories or blood, or something worse. And the fama, the healers never denied it. Padre Elias only warned, we never claimed to heal, we only open the door. What walks through is not ours to control. One woman, before fleeing with her sick daughter in the dead of night, was overheard saying, they don't heal us, they replace us. And yet, still they came. The silence of São Lucio became its own form of scripture. No songs, no laughter, just quiet devotion, and the constant hum of something living beneath the earth. When asked why they stayed, villagers would simply say, because we are part of the pact now, and offer no further explanation. The hill never stopped breathing. Some said it began to breathe faster. By the time Helena Duarte reached the village of São Lucio, she had already lost 3 colleagues to miracles. One who drowned in the river after drinking from a chalice of healing water. One who vanished in the jungles of Acre chasing whispers of an immortal child, and one whose final article was nothing but a page filled with spirals and the word listen repeated over and over, etched with blood under her fingernails. And yet, Helena, the youngest investigative journalist at Correio Paulista, wasn't afraid, at least not at first, for she had been raised by nuns who spoke in riddles and trained by editors who beat fear out of her like air from dough. So when the story of the village that cured blindness, reversed paralysis, and made the rich tremble with hope crossed her desk, she packed only what she needed: a notebook wrapped in waxed canvas, a folding Kodak camera small enough to hide under her underskirt, a silver cross for sentiment, and a small vial of belladonna tucked into her boot. In case silence wasn't enough, as her mentor had once warned. The train took her only part way. The rest was on foot. 6 days through mud and animal stench and rain that didn't feel like rain, but like skin. And on the 7th day she arrived at Sao Lucio, hair matted, boots ruined, and smile sharpened by suspicion. Posing as a woman slowly losing her hearing, she gained entry easily, another lost soul drawn to the holy wound of the jungle, and the villagers, with their watchful silences and oddly synchronized blinking, led her to a low hut near the edge of the hill, where Padre Elias's voice could be heard each dusk, low and syrupy, chanting prayers that seemed stitched from multiple languages at once, bits of Latin, pieces of Guarani, tones she couldn't place but felt in her spine like the hiss of a kettle just before the scream. The first week, Helena wrote everything: smells, faces, phrases, the strange ticking noise in the chapel that no one else acknowledged, the way the children stared at nothing during meals as though waiting for something to arrive. And she sketched, too, mostly Isa, the mute girl, who still hadn't aged since 1926 according to old reports, and whose eyes seemed to dilate when Helena lied, as if the pupils were attuned not to light but to intent. She caught glimpses of the healing rituals, though no one called them that aloud. Isa pressing her palm to a woman's stomach and whispering something directly into the navel. My Graciela blowing into the mouth of a dead man until his chest jerked like a fish on a hook. And Padre Elias pouring salt in the shape of a tree and chanting until his shadow stopped matching his movements. But Helena kept quiet, biding her time, documenting carefully, secretly collecting strands of Isa's hair, smudges of wax, and stolen pages from the chapel that bore markings not unlike ancient maps or musical scores that seemed to weep when held near flame. Yet for all her training and resilience, the village began to work on her, not through terror or charm, but through the erosion of anchors. Her memory started slipping, first names, then dates, then the smell of her own perfume, which had once defined her, and, more troubling still, her camera jammed on the third night, and her notebook pages began to vanish, not ripped, not burned, but blank, as if the ink had receded into itself. And when she accused a villager, they only placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "It's not theft, it's protection." And she understood suddenly why everyone here walked as if afraid of waking something. On the 9th day, she witnessed a girl with seizures speak in perfect Tupi, a language nearly extinct, preserved only in fragments by university scholars. And she spoke it not like a learned tongue, but like a birthright, her eyes rolling into her skull as she recited what Helena would later try to translate as, "The river remembers even what the sun forgets." She reported the incident in a letter that never reached her editor, because by then her voice was already unraveling, literally, like thread pulled from her throat, beginning with hoarseness, then gaps in consonants, until by the 12th day, Helena could not form a word, only breath in shape of meaning, and Isa would sit near her and watch, sometimes mimicking her expressions, sometimes tilting her head as if hearing someone Helena could not. Every attempt to write was met with disappearing ink. Every attempt to speak with a mouth that no longer obeyed, and she realized then that it wasn't magic they feared, it was language itself, for something in this place responded to articulation like a wolf to a whistle. The villagers began to avoid her altogether, eyes lowered, mouths unmoving, and the rituals changed, grew quieter, deeper, as if burrowing into the soil rather than the soul, and Padre Elias no longer preached but simply hummed, a low, bone-deep vibration that made Helena's stomach convulse and her dreams bleed into her waking hours. On the 15th night, she attempted to flee, dragging herself toward the jungle trail with a torn map she'd etched in charcoal. But the trees did not look the same, and the jungle did not open, did not want her gone. So she turned back, defeated and débaillé. That's when Isa came, not as a child, but as something standing just outside her line of comprehension, holding a cloth bundle containing Helena's last words. A single phrase stitched in red. They only speak when no one listens. The next morning, a villager reported seeing Helena in the chapel, kneeling beside Padre Elias, her head shaved, her lips stitched, not with thread, but with thorns, and no one questioned it. Weeks later, back in Sao Paulo, her editor received the cloth, with the stitched message and a photograph of an altar filled with small wooden tongues suspended by hair. It was the last time anyone tried to investigate São Lucio. By the dawn of 1941, São Lucio had become quieter than death. Not in the way a place becomes forgotten, but in the way a church becomes a tomb, when the prayers run out and only the echoes remain. The jungle still rustled, and the wind still murmured over the chapel roof, but something had shifted in the marrow of the village, as if the soil itself had decided to hold its breath, and the people followed suit. Men who once farmed with chant and gratitude now walked barefoot in silence, eyes lowered as if the sun had become an intruder. Women wrapped their infants in cloth, covered with spiral symbols and tied ribbons around their mouths. Children no longer laughed, not even in sleep. And the visitors, fewer now, almost none, came with offerings in hand, but left with dread in their eyes, for the gates to the chapel had closed and the faith healers, the ones they'd traveled across 100 miles of jungle to beg for help, no longer emerged. Padre Elias had not been seen in nearly 3 months, not since his final sermon where he spoke not to the crowd but to the rafters, as if addressing something unseen above them, something with rules and hunger. And afterward, the villagers watched him walk into the hill's shadow and never come out. My Graciela was found days later, her body cradled in the curve of the river like an offering, her hands folded over her chest, her tongue removed with a surgeon's precision and replaced with a twig wrapped in hair, an act that no one claimed and everyone accepted. And Isa, the girl whose age had never advanced, who spoke only through eyes darker than oil, simply vanished. Not in a way that suggested escape or death, but as if the earth had finally reabsorbed her, claimed its instrument, unwrapped its voice and folded it back into soil and stone. Fear took root quickly, but not the kind that makes people flee. In São Lucio, it was the kind that petrifies, that keeps people exactly where they are, terrified of being noticed by something that might only strike if you move. When word reached the capital that something was wrong with the miracle village, the government, pressured by politicians who had once sent sick relatives there in secret, authorized an expedition, not to investigate, but to modernize, which in bureaucratic language meant contain, explain, and if needed, erase. A dozen men in starched uniforms arrived by boat and horseback, armed with rifles, Bibles, and a deep resentment for anything they couldn't categorize. They expected resistance, maybe jungle sickness or crazed villagers, but what they found unnerved them far more. A place suspended in spiritual rigor mortis where the villagers would not speak, not write, not gesture beyond vague nods or stares that lasted too long. The officials split into 3 teams. One to question the villagers. They got no answers. One to inspect the healer's compound. They found it abandoned. And one to examine the chapel, which they had to break open, for the door was sealed shut with wax, thorns, and hair. Inside, they found no pews, only rows of soil mounds like shallow graves, a ceiling covered in burnt spirals, hundreds of eyes carved into the wood with such precision that one soldier dropped his flashlight, convinced they were blinking. In the pulpit lay Padre Elias's rosary, the bone beads cracked, and Ara, agate into the shape of a human tongue. On the altar sat bowls of ash, glass jars filled with teeth, and pages sewn together into a single sheet that bore no words, only rows of tiny open mouths, painted in a rust-colored ink that smelled like copper and clove. They confiscated the items, photographed everything, and ordered the villagers to prepare for relocation, schooling, and integration with the national body. But the villagers did not react. They simply returned to their homes, closed the shutters, and waited. Over the next few nights, 3 officials disappeared. One was last seen entering the jungle to relieve himself and was never found. Another locked himself inside a storage shed and gouged out his own eardrums with a nail. And the third was discovered in the chapel, curled in fetal position, whispering, "They're listening through the dirt," again and again, until his voice vanished completely. Unnerved and ashamed, the expedition retreated, filing their reports under internal classification codes and quietly discouraging any future missions to São Lucio. The village was declared unfit for productive development and struck from several maps over the following years, becoming a place locals referred to only in indirect phrases, where the river hums, where the girl stood still, or where silence goes to sleep. And though decades passed, the silence did not erode. If anything, it deepened, became ritualistic, a kind of holy abandonment. And though Brazil modernized and cities sprawled, São Lucio remained untouched, visited only by the rare traveler who ignored warnings or followed dream fragments to the edge of known land. Those who found the village claimed strange phenomena, dreams of being buried alive yet breathing, whispers that came from beneath rocks or behind trees even though no one was there, and most commonly, sightings of a girl in white walking up the hill at dusk, her feet never disturbing the dust, her face serene but unfinished, as though reality hadn't fully drawn her in. Some said she was Isa reborn. Others believed she was a spirit, warning trespassers. And a few believed she was the hill itself made flesh, wearing the last body it had borrowed. One linguist who ventured there in 1907 claimed the symbols in the chapel matched no known language but responded to sound frequencies. He believed the carvings weren't static writings, but reactive diagrams, as if the wood was waiting to hear the right word to unlock something. He never published his findings, instead retreating to a monastery where he lived the rest of his life in silence. Another traveler in 1884 reported waking to find his tent surrounded by villagers who stood perfectly still, eyes closed, mouths open, humming in unison a pitch so low it cracked the metal base of his stove. He left immediately and never returned. The road to Lucio faded, became overgrown, the jungle reclaiming it with vines and mud. But still, the place existed, not abandoned but deliberately muted, as if protected by a pact none of the living fully understood. Some believe the silence is protection, that the village guards a secret too dangerous for speech, something older than language itself. Perhaps an entity bound by the stillness of human mouths. Others whisper that the silence is punishment, that the healers failed to control the forces they invoked, and now São Lucio exists as a living tomb for their mistake, a monument to what happens when miracles refuse to obey. And yet the hill still breathes at night, faint, slow, but steady, and every so often someone sees the girl in white, walking toward the summit where no one goes, her head tilted upward, eyes closed, as if listening to the heartbeat of the world beneath her feet. And for a brief moment, they feel as if they understand something sacred, terrible, and irreversible. But it vanishes the moment they speak, for the spirits may be gone, the healers long buried or forgotten. But in São Lucio, Sile Miha, Nice was always the final sermon, and it still echoes long after the last tongue was stilled.